Every strategy in Commander explained. First off, I'm sure there are some niche strategies I'm missing, or maybe some more obvious ones. It's all good. If I did, I'll make a second video. In the top left corner of the screen, you'll see two icons, the first being the strategy's difficulty, and the second being the points in the game in which the strategy is the best. Grab your snacks and drinks. This will be a long one. Blink decks are based around playing creatures with powerful enter the battlefield abilities like Avenger of Zendikar, which creates a massive amount of tokens when it enters, and casting blink spells like Ephemerate to exile and return them to play to reuse their enter the battlefield triggers. Blink decks are easy to play and excel in the mid and late game, being able to cast bombs with powerful ETBs. Tribal decks choose a creature type like Goblin, for example, and run cards to buff that creature type like Coat of Arms to either swarm or outvalue opponents. The most notable tribes are Elf and the aforementioned Goblins, but you can get spicy with birds, Vishino, Phyrexian, squirrels, dogs, cats, pretty much whatever you're feeling. Tribal decks are aggressive and excel in the early game and mid game, being able to flood the board very quickly. VOLTRON decks are based around using powerful equipments like Commander's Plate, auras like Eldrazi's Conscription, and counters from cards like Luminarch's Aspirant to buff your commander and deal 21 commander damage to opponents. VOLTRON decks are hard as they have to be swinging with one big creature, which leaves you open to being attacked. They excel in the mid and late game once your commander can become an actual threat. Token decks are based around swarming the field with creature tokens with cards like Bitter Blossom and buffing them with cards like Cathar's Crusade to swing face with massive boards. Token decks are easy to play and excel in the early, mid, and late game, being able to set up board states quick with just a couple token creators, which leaves plenty of cards in hand for the mid and late game. Artifact decks focus on playing cost-efficient artifacts like Lita Mechanical Engineer to control the early mid-game, and cost reducers like Foundry Inspector to bring in late games with early threats like Blightsteel Colossus. Artifact decks are moderate difficulty and are good in the early, mid, and late game. Unlike VOLTRON decks, equipment decks focus on making one creature or multiple creatures bigger using equipments like Blackblade Reforged to win the game. Instead of trying to win with commander damage, these decks run cards like Champion of the Flame and Evasive Commanders to deal massive damage with equipped creatures. These decks are hard for the same reasons VOLTRON is hard though. You're going to have a bunch of tapped creatures which leaves you open, and then you have to find room in your deck for equipments, but it's best mid and late game, and if you like a challenge, these decks might be your style. Wheel decks focus on giving us value just for drawing cards, with cards like Teferi's Ageless Insight, and hurting your opponents for doing the same with cards like Psychosis Crawler to deal damage to them. Wheel decks run wheel cards like Windfall to make players discard their hands and redraw to trigger all this value. Wheel decks are moderately difficult and excel in the early and mid game and can win games out of nowhere. Land decks focus on getting value just from playing lands, comboing sack lands like Terramorphic Expanse with cards that allow you to play lands from the graveyard like Runamap Excavators, to trigger value engines like Rampaging Baloths. Land decks are fairly easy and excel in the mid and late game when they can set up their value engines. Mill decks focus on removing every card from your opponent's decks with cards like Traumatize and Hedron Crab, causing them to lose when they can't draw. Mill decks are easy to play and excel in the early and mid game when they plan to set up a full deck mill and end the game out of nowhere. Super Friends is just a Planeswalker deck that uses their powerful abilities and ultimates to win games. Super Friends is fairly hard to play for the fact you have to remember which Planeswalkers you've used, which ones you haven't, which ones you should ult, which ones you shouldn't, which one you should let die, which ones you shouldn't, but they excel mid and late game when you can get like 2 or 3 Planeswalkers out. Enchantment decks play value engines that draw you cards for playing enchantments like Mesa Enchantress, allowing you to flood the board with more powerful enchantments like Sigil of the Empty Throne and keep a full hand. Equipment decks are moderately difficult due to having to remember slightly more triggers than most decks, and excel in the mid and late game when you can set up a ton of powerful enchantments in play. Battlecruiser decks focus on surviving the early game with answers like Wrath of God in order to drop those sweet giant spells Commander was made for, like all the Eldrazi's. Battlecruiser decks are easy to play as you just run removal and then all your favorite late game giant spells. And clearly, Battlecruiser excels in the late game. Pillow Fort decks focus on making it hard for the opponents to interact with you in any way, with cards like Ghostly Prisons to prevent attacking and Defense Grid to prevent removal and counter spells, until you can pull off a combo or whatever your preferred way to win is. Pillow Fort decks are easy to play and excel all game as long as you have a way to win in mind. Discard decks are all about resource denial. We don't want our opponents to have any cards in their hands using cards like Bottomless Pit or Dream Stealer. Bring home the game however you want. Discard decks are easy to play if you don't mind getting the crappy looks across the table. They excel in the early and mid game before opponents can get a chance to develop large hands. Reanimator decks are about putting late game powerful creatures into your graveyard like Grave Titan with cards like Entomb, and then cheating them out early with cards like Reanimate. Reanimator decks are fairly easy to play and pretty solid all game, being able to cheat out huge threats early and mid game while running those huge threats that you'll already be playing late game. Aristocrat decks focus around playing sack outlets like Ashnod's Altar and death triggers like Blood Artist, sacrificing your own creatures to trigger large amounts of value on your side. Aristocrat decks are moderately difficult because you need to know what to sack and when, and what triggers because you're sacking stuff. Aristocrat decks are great mid-game and late game when they set up crazy value engines. Life gain decks focus on raising your life total with cards like Beacon of Immortality and running cards that give you value for it like Sarah Ascendant. Life gain decks are easy to play but considerably one of the weakest strategies. They're pretty weak all game, but again, if you like a challenge, go for it. Gift decks focus around running cards that can give your opponents your permanents, with cards like Zedru Kindhearted. Those permanents you give them are going to be one of two things. One, huge creatures like Blightsteel Colossus that you just convince your opponents to smack other opponents with, or two, and more likely, really bad cards like Steel Golem, which throw a huge wrench in opponents' plans. Gift decks are fairly hard to play, as you have to know who to give what and be ready to make enemies at the table. They excel in the mid and late game once they start playing stuff they can actually give away to opponents. Political decks are based around politics, allowing players to vote with cards like Expropriate, introducing Monarch with cards like Court of Grace, turning players against each other with cards like Turf War, as well as playing the metagame at the table trying to get in people's heads. Political decks are hard to play for the social aspects, and excel in the mid or late game when you've gotten in the opponent's head just enough. Goad decks are based around forcing your opponents to swing their creatures at each other instead of you with cards like Disrupt Decorum or Mave, while you watch the chaos. Goad decks are easy to play as they have one goal: make your opponents smack each other all game. Goad decks excel at whatever point in the game your opponents have creatures. Exile decks focus around exiling their own cards off top and casting those cards from exile with cards like Commune with Lava for bonuses and value from cards like Prosper Tombbound. Exile decks are easy to play and good all game because their whole strategy is just giving you cards to play. Gotta love it. Pain stacks, otherwise known as Group Slug, are really all about damaging your opponents for breathing. If they play, draw, attack, etc., they're gonna have to pay for it through cards like Mana Barbs or Zozu the Punisher. Pain stacks is easy to play, again, if you don't mind making some enemies, and excels in the mid and late game when opponents are in full swing. Tap untap decks are based around running permanents that can tap or untap other permanents like Kelpie Guide or Thousand Year Elixir to either 1. Lock your opponent's creatures down for you to swing at, or untap and reuse powerful activated abilities like Intrepid Hero or Aethersworn Adjudicator. Tap untap decks are moderately easy to play due to there being a lot of activations and is best mid and late game. Stacks decks are a form of control deck. These decks focus on playing artifacts and enchantments that make playing the game for opponents nearly impossible with cards like Winter's Orb and Grand Arbiter Augustine. Walk on eggshells. Stack decks are hard to play as you have to remember all the punishment you're putting on your opponents, as well as finding a way to win. They excel all game and are a pain in the ass. Spellslinger decks are based around playing high-efficiency, high-power instants and sorceries like Brainstorm and Time Stretch, respectively, along with recursion and copying effects like Archaeomancer and Teach by Example, respectively, to reuse and double these powerful spells to win the game. These decks are hard to play because you need to know when to play your spells, in what order to play your spells, when to copy your spells, and they're pretty solid all game because you have plenty of answers and plenty of card draw. Similar to Spellslinger, Storm is based around instants and sorceries. Storm, however, is about playing as many instants and sorceries as possible in one turn for powerful bonuses through Storm cards, like Grape Shot and Tendrils of Agony, which can copy themselves for each spell cast before it. Storm decks are good early and mid-game, as their intent is to get a Storm count up as fast as possible to try to win. +1/+1 counter decks are based around putting 1/1 counters on one or many creatures with cards like Ivy Lane Denizen or Feldar's Retreat to create threats that you'll use to bash face later. 1/1 counter decks are easy and pretty solid all game as their early game threats scale late game. -1/-1 counter decks are based around putting -1/-1 counters on opponents' creatures to destroy and weaken them with cards like Black Sun Zenith, which trigger bonuses with cards like Scorpion God. -1/-1 counter decks are pretty good all game, and they're pretty easy to play, but not played enough in my opinion. Burn decks focus on doing direct damage to opponents through instants, sorceries, and triggers with cards like Devil's Play and Court of Ire. They are hyper-aggressive and plan to win fast. Burn decks are easy to play and plan to win as early as possible, but are notably weak, maybe even weaker than life gain. So again, if you like a challenge, Weenie decks are focused on playing small value creatures like Blade Splicer and Sabira, flooding the board and buffing them to win. Unlike token decks, Weenie decks cast their creatures, which can lead to fun triggers with cards like Beast Whisperer. Weenie decks are easy to play and best in the early game. Group hug decks are for the good of the table. The name of the game is making sure no one falls behind with cards like Rites of Flourishing and Humble Defector. Everyone is treated equal. Help out the table and make no enemies. Second place is just fine. Unless you plan to combo. Group hug decks are easy to play because the whole table loves ya, and it pretty much works all game. Theft decks are based around playing with the opponent's cards, stealing them off top of the library, from the hand, or from the battlefield with cards like Gonti and Mind Control. Theft decks are easy to play and excel mid and late game when the good stuff starts being played. Toughness Matters decks focus on putting up strong defenses against attacks using large toughness creatures like Dora and the Siege Tower, then playing cards that allow them to deal damage equal to their toughness like Assault Formation to win. They're easy to play and pretty solid all game. Chaos decks are based around warping the rules of the game itself, creating insane board states and, well, chaos, with cards like Scrambleverse and Warp World. Watching the opponent squirm is just gravy. Chaos decks are hard to play because they have so many different rule state changes. They're great late game when things get real crazy though. And finally, we've got Infect decks. Infect decks are based around dealing 10 infect damage as quickly as possible with cards like Glistening Oil and Rot Priest. Extremely quick, hostile, and hated, Infect decks are feared and efficient. Infect decks are pretty solid all game, but excel at dealing early game lethal damage. And there you have it. I hope this video might have inspired you to build a new deck type. Again, I don't think I got every single deck type in there, so if I missed one, drop it in the comments, or if you want to shout out some of your favorite strategies or decks you use, please feel free to comment them down below. Much love. If you want to support the channel, leave a subscribe, like, share, do all that stuff, and go play some Magic.